to the churches, and we are here in a church, unions, academia. That's the second level. And the third level are the decision makers. It may seem like the decision makers are very far away, but let's remember the decision makers are on the municipal level, on the state level, and eventually on the federal level. And even if the decision makers, especially on the federal level, don't like us very much, they don't want to listen, but we can force them to listen. We can make them take action. I'll also explain how. So we need to make a plan, we need to build a strategy, and we have to also think about who are our partners along the way, not to forget the media, not to forget that in order for an action to be meaningful, it needs to be amplified on social media, but also on mainstream media, on corporate media, anyway, through our contacts. Let's use our contacts to make this action effective. And this is part of the strategy of what civil society organizations often call theory of change. Is the term theory of change familiar to everybody? Yeah, okay. So that's what makes for strategic action. And I don't want to create now a whole workshop because we don't have time for how to do this, but one thing I do want to highlight, because there's always this dilemma, what we should start with. How do we get started? Do we start with the research or do we start with the networking? We need the research so we know what targets to go after. We need to know here in Pittsburgh, which are the companies that are complicit in the genocide, enabling the genocide, in the apartheid system. We need to identify them. We also need to learn about these companies to know which companies are vulnerable to pressure. Who are the owners? What are their weak parts? Which coalitions already exist, which are already protesting these companies, maybe for other reasons as well, like environmental reasons, work relation reasons, and so on. But we also, so we need this information. The research is very important, but we also need to keep in mind, maybe somebody's already done the research. And if we make the right connections through networking, maybe we can connect to the groups that will help us do the research that we need. And maybe the research will tell us which are the groups we need to get in touch with. So there's always this chicken and egg dilemma. Where do we get started? My suggestion to you is absolutely start the research, but also get in touch with me. Send me an email. Tell me we're interested in this particular campaign with this particular company maybe, and we're thinking of doing something, and I can get you in touch with the other groups because that's my job. I'm coordinating the military embargo, so coordinating means to get you in touch with other groups that might be interested. And so I think Howlett is one of the companies that I've heard has its headquarters here in Pittsburgh and is a very relevant company because it makes components for war jets, very relevant for us, for the F-35 for example, but apparently Howlett also has a factory in the UK. So there's also a very large Palestinian solidarity movement, and maybe they have no idea about what the Howlett company is doing here in Pittsburgh. So here's an urgent need for networking between the different groups. So these are, I would say, the guidelines, the basic guidelines of the military embargo campaigns. BDS has its own guidelines. I don't know if I should repeat them because maybe they're well known. I've seen that, I've spoken to some of you, and I know that there are already BDS activists here in the room. So you know that BDS opposes all kinds of racism, discrimination of all kinds, including anti-Semitism, Islamophobia, and so on. And we build our movement in an intersectional, respectful way, ethical ways, which is a very important part of our guidelines. But I also wanted to say that through this process of following the guidelines very closely, we achieve successes. We get results. And again, I know that here in the United States, you might have a feeling that there is not enough happening because the US is indeed the biggest supplier of weapons to Israel, but not the only one. And not only this, the US doesn't have a border with Israel. So the weapons have to go through the Mediterranean, have to go through territories in the European Union. One by one, the countries in the European Union have made declarations, and more of them will, that they will refuse to allow the transit of weapons from the United States to Israel. A little known fact is that the military embargo has three sides to it. Three sides that's very important. One is that it's illegal to sell weapons to a country which is committing war crimes, genocide. Two is it's illegal to buy weapons from such a country because you're financing the arms industry of that country. And third, it's illegal to transit weapons. Takes a long time for people to understand this, but this is why research is so important. And the networking is so important, that this information needs to be shared by all the different groups, and starting from the grassroots people, and eventually the governments cannot ignore the people on the grassroots level, on the civil society level. And so we have Spain, Portugal, Belgium, Ireland, Netherlands, Italy, Greece, Cyprus. I'm just talking about Europe now. I could of course also talk about Malaysia, Namibia, Colombia, outside of Europe. But I mentioned the European ones first just because this is where the path of the weapons that are going from the United States, and so which is so important. The governments are saying, well, we can't violate international law. We cannot allow U.S. ships or ships coming from the U.S., not necessarily U.S.-owned ships, but ships coming from the U.S. carrying weapons to Israel or dual-use items to Israel to pass through our territory. We can't allow the planes to pass through our territorial space, our air. And we've seen amazing progress with these countries, which comes from below, from these groups, from BDS groups in these countries, which are first doing the research, networking with each other, then going to the media and telling them, we're going to organize a big demonstration. In Spain, they were able to bring in 600,000 people to protest the arms transiting to Israel. And after 600,000 people take to the street, suddenly the government said, oh, we want to protest with you because we don't want to be on the wrong side of this protest. I had meetings with members of parliament. I had a meeting with a minister in Spain. The minister told me initially, I'm from a small party, there's very little I can do. If I leave the government in protest for selling weapons to Israel or transiting weapons to Israel, the government will fall, my political career will be over. And then he stopped for a second and said, maybe a genocide is a time that I'm not supposed to think about my political career. And when he found himself in this moment, in this dilemma, then he found a creative way to talk to the prime minister. And the same prime minister of Spain who initially was lying about Spanish arms trade with Israel and profiting from them, ended up going to the European Union and saying, we all have to impose a military embargo on Israel. Now the ICJ, the International Court of Justice, ruled on July 19th that that the entire occupation is illegal, and that Israel is an apartheid state, and that third states are obligated to impose sanctions on Israel. This was a decision of the court that was endorsed by the United Nations in a vote where 124 countries voted in favor. That's more than 2/3 majority. 14 countries voted against, US and Israel among these 14, of course. But this means that the military embargo is very strong, and the Israelis feel it. And this is something very important. I want to go back to what I promised. I'll talk about the war of 1973. I don't know how many of you are aware of this history. Most of you must have heard of this war as the Yom Kippur War because it started on a Jewish holiday, the holiday of Yom Kippur, and it started on October 6th with a surprise attack by Egypt and Syria against Israel. The thing is about on a holiday, so exactly 50 years and 1 day before the October 7 attack. The thing about this war is that after the occupation of 67, where Israel occupied the West Bank, Gaza Strip, Syrian Golan, and the Sinai Peninsula, the biggest arms supplier to Israel at the time was France, and France imposed a military embargo on Israel, saying we will only sell weapons to Israel again after Israel withdraw from the occupied territory. And the Israelis said, who needs France anyway? We can make everything domestically. We'll build massive factories and production lines inside Israel so that we make our own weapons. And they spent a lot of money on this. And 6 years later was this war, 1973, the October War. And the Israeli weapons were useless. They didn't work. Against the Soviet weapons that the Egyptians and the Syrians were using, the Israeli weapons didn't work. And Israel was very close to losing that war until the United States stepped in with its weapons, just as it did in the current genocide. So this is, well, it's an interesting history lesson. But now, the military embargo has become so strong and the momentum is so big that the Israeli newspapers, the Israeli radio stations, television stations, they recognize it. Even though they know that the United States will continue, or at least believe and hope that the United States will continue to give them weapons, some are questioning whether Trump will continue to give the weapons for free. But they said because of all of the transiting problems and because of all the components that need to be brought from other countries and all the weapons that are imported from other countries other than the US, this is a problem. And so the budget for the year 2025 that the Israeli government has to pass through the parliament, through the Knesset, usually they have to pass it by October the previous year. So they should have passed it already last October. They haven't. They made a new law that may give them more time. So they're still working on the budget of 2025. And in this budget, they're planning to spend tens of billions of dollars to build all of the production lines for weapons domestically. They want to make all the weapons themselves, the tanks, the warships, the warplanes, the artillery, the rifles, everything will be made in Israel. Does this remind you of something? Is this not exactly the same mistake they made 50 years ago? And this also shows, well, a very short historical memory that the Israelis have, but also that they have no choice because the military embargo is working. So this is a sign that the military embargo is working, is moving forward very fast, and I hope very much that my visit here and in other U.S. cities will help grow the part of the military embargo in the United States, even if you may think that the chances of getting the federal government to stop the weapons are low. But this doesn't mean that your contribution to the military embargo is not critical. It is critical. Because the groups in other countries also need your research. They need your solidarity. They need this connection. They also need to combine networking and research. And they need to be in touch with you. And they might be able to tell you, look, there's something you can do here in Pittsburgh that would be tremendously important for our campaign. If you want, I can give you an example of this sort of thing with the UAW. I don't know if anyone knows the UAW union, and maybe some of you even have contacts with them. The UAW has the ability to make the arms production in Israel grind to a halt without going on strike. Without going on strike, they can do it. But they need to be convinced that this is important and that they should go ahead with it. And if you want, I'll explain how. The last thing I wanted to say is that, and then we can open for questions and get into more nitty-gritty details as much as you want. But the last thing I wanted to say is that what we're doing in BDS with the military embargo is that we're trying to build all of our messaging around the military embargo on 3 arguments. We take one by one each of these arms deals that either are selling weapons